Hey guys, it's Aman
and Christina
from
Our Rich Journey.
Today's video is all about emergency funds, and that's funds with an S, because traditionally we think about the emergency fund as being one pot of money to get you through a disaster. But in reality, there are 4 other types of funds that everyone should have. And on today's video, we are going to tell you exactly what those funds should be in order to protect you as you pursue financial independence.
Now, like Aman said, most people think of an emergency fund in the traditional sense, which is saving about 3 to 6 months of living expenses in case someone loses a job. If you're a dual income family, financial experts typically say you should save about 3 months of living expenses. But if you're a single income family, the idea is that you should be saving about 6 months of living expenses.
Now with your traditional fund, that 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses, you usually want to have it in a bank that's going to give you a high yield or a high interest rate on your deposit. Most of those banks are going to be online banks, and we're not going to get into a whole lot of detail on which banks those could be, but just know that most of those banks are not the types of banks that you can just walk right into and take that money out. There's a process to transfer that money.
And it's good that there is a process to getting the money out so that you can't get it out immediately. You can get it out quickly, but if you can get the money out too quickly, then it's more likely that you're gonna mix the funds or that you're gonna use those funds for non-emergency expenses.
But you know, it takes most Americans a very long time to establish a traditional emergency fund. I mean, 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses doesn't happen overnight. It could take people years and years to save that kind of money. But along the way, it's important to have other types of emergency funds, which brings us to the first one, which is a stash of cash.
One of the important reasons to have a stash of cash on hand is because if you have money in a bank, you have a limit as to how much you can withdraw with an ATM, especially if that bank is somewhere distant. You can't present yourself personally and take out the money. So having a stash of cash on hand, which is greater than the amount that you can withdraw with an ATM card, is very, very important when you're in an emergency and you need a lot of cash. So we like to call this our first emergency fund, always having cash on hand. I mean, imagine a situation where there's a blizzard or there's a complete power shutout or someone steals your identity and you have no access to your accounts and you need cash on hand immediately. This is why you need this type of fund available.
So I have always had a stash of cash. Even when I was a kid, I would go out and I would keep like $20 in my sock. That is a stash of cash. But for a real family in America, you only need about $1,000 stowed away somewhere in your house that you can get to easily.
Now, we're not recommending the sock method here. Really, the best place to keep it is in a waterproof container or a fireproof container that's somewhere in your house that's easily accessible.
And it doesn't have to be a traditional safe. You could even hide it in things that aren't as obvious. Now they have these safes that are like called mask safes, where maybe it's a mayonnaise jar or a book of some sort. But anyway, you want to have this cash in a place that you and the rest of your family know where this money is in case you need to get to it. So the second type is to have an emergency fund at a local bank. This is really important that the bank is right in town, someplace that you can drive or walk to very easily, go in and take money out immediately.
Now, this is different than your traditional emergency fund of 3 to 6 months. In your local bank, you really only need to have 1 month of expense, but you want to have it in a local bank so it's quickly and easily accessible.
Now, you may not get the best interest rate at your local bank, but what's most important is that the money is easily accessible. Something else about having this money locally is when you devise this account, you don't want to have this account with your other accounts. This should be at a different bank altogether, because what's important is that you don't want to have too much easy access to the money to where let's say you're banking in your regular bank account and you just move money back and forth between your emergency fund. You want to have this money accessible, but you want to have a little bit of friction in between you and that money. So the reasons why you want to have this local bank set up is because you're going to keep about a month's worth of living expenses at the local bank. And let's say you have a very big emergency. Now, most emergencies, they kind of take time to unfold. Like if you lose your job, you're not going to need all of your emergency fund at once. So you have your local bank and you will transfer money from your online bank that's giving you the higher yield into the local bank. And you will live off of those expenses. Now, it's going to take time to do that transfer, but having that amount of money in your local bank allows the buffer for you to get to that money.
Now, you might not always need to tap into your large emergency fund by transferring your online funds over to a local bank. Sometimes you might just need to access money that's in your local bank very shortly and very quickly. And a situation like this could be when you're in crisis mode or you have a relative or a friend that's in crisis mode. If you're in a relationship, for example, or if you have a friend that's in a relationship that needs to get out of that relationship and go somewhere safe but needs money accessible in order to do that, you can always tap into your local bank, get that money very quickly, and move to a safer situation.
Now, we use that as an example of an emergency because that's how emergencies happen. They are sudden, they are unpredictable, and having that safeguard of having that money close by, and if it's a large amount of money, you want to keep it in a local bank, it really comes into play.
And the next form of an emergency fund that you want to establish is in the form of credit cards.
Oh, whoa, credit cards. Now, you guys are not going to like this one because we're not talking about you need a credit card because there's an emergency sale at Macy's. All right, we are talking about you need to have credit cards in place because you cannot use cash sometimes in an emergency.
So what Amanda is really trying to say here is you don't want to have credit cards that you can abuse, but you want to have 3 credit cards with very healthy credit limits so that you can rely on them in case you're in an emergency.
Yeah, but we say 3 credit cards because there are 3 major credit card companies. There's American Express, MasterCard, and Visa. And those are the companies that when you're in a bind, you want to make sure that you have a card that is accepted. And your last emergency fund is not really a fund, but it's a person, okay? So you must always have someone that has your back in a financial situation. For us, we know who those people are. We know that if we are in a bind and we don't have access to our credit cards, we don't have access to our funds or our cash, we can pick up the phone and someone will show up and help us out. So if you don't have that person, you need to establish that because that person will come into play at some point in your life.
Now, I think what's really important with this type of fund or this type of relationship is that it has to go said. It can't go unsaid. So you have to have this conversation with your friend or your family member or whomever it is, and you have to discuss the type of relationship or the exchange relationship that you'll have in the event of an emergency. You have to be able to rely on that person, and that person can rely on you in an emergency, and it should be a stated conversation that you have.
Now we say friends, but this can also be family. It really has to be someone that is close to you as far as proximity. Someone that can get down to the police station, maybe they get you, or if your house burns down, you can just go right next door to their house. But it's one of those things that they, like the emergency fund, the cash, this person also has to be accessible.
So these are the 4 different emergency funds that we think that you should have in addition to the traditional emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of living expenses. These funds are very critical because you don't always see the emergency in the traditional sense, which is losing your job. There's various forms of emergencies and various forms of money that you need to access other than the traditional sense. Now, if you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and join the journey.